I was going to say, we probably won't go through introductions. I'm just aware that we could spend a bit of time doing that, and we probably just want to get straight into questions. So as I said, we've received a few questions. One was from Beth from Te Tunga Whānau, but I don't think she's here, but I think it's probably still a really relevant question. So I thought we'd kick off with that. So she says, I think many of us want to know what happens to our otherwise permanent but determinedly unvaxxed staffers when our organisation runs out of work that can be done from home or without contact with those who take the other vax data seriously. How would Shima lay out a procedurally sound redundancy/termination process?
Right. Starting with a big one.
Yeah.
But first thing to be really clear about is this is not a redundancy situation. The role is there, the work needs to be done. The problem is that individual is not able to carry out the work, either because they're subject to a mandatory vaccination order, or if the workplace is not captured by those orders, but the employer has carried out a risk assessment and gone through a consultation process with staff. So there's sort of two parts to that answer, really, and I break it down because different people will fall into different groups. So if it is a person who is covered by one of the mandatory vaccination orders, then the process is somewhat simpler in the sense that the organisation goes through the process of saying, right, we consider that you are a person who is captured, and these are the reasons why, and we need to talk to you about that. We have put in place interim measures, working from home, or contactless provision of services or remote provision of services, but that no longer works. And in terms of Section 103A of the Employment Relations Act, the employer has an obligation to put their concerns to an employee, give the employee an opportunity to respond before making any decision that has a bearing on that person's ongoing employment. So that is, and I always would recommend you start less formally, give yourself room to move into a more formal process. So that initially is a process of, and I'm sure you're all well down this path, of having conversations, about answering questions, about providing information so that you're supporting people around their decision to be vaccinated. Reading Beth's, I like the determinedly unvaccinated description. With those people, if they are adamant that they're not going to be vaccinated, it is then a matter of writing to them formally, inviting them to a meeting, explaining the conversations you've had, explaining that you no longer have remote work for them to do, and that therefore the organisation is considering terminating their employment, and that they need to come to a meeting, they need to discuss this, that they have the right to bring a support person or representative to that meeting. So it's like a disciplinary meeting. It's the same sort of letter and cautions that go into that letter, and then having that meeting with them. No predetermination, but genuinely, these are the employer's concerns. This is the situation we're in. Giving the employee an opportunity to respond, and then making a decision after that. And crucially, as part of that, is this consideration of alternatives. Does the employee have any alternatives that they want the employer to consider? So taking Beth's example, you've looked at alternative duties, whether the employee says, well, actually, I am employed as a permanent employee, but I can see there's only, 10 hours a week, I could be part-time. They might say, what if I took a leave of absence for several months? Let's see where the COVID landscape lies. It's really important that before you make any decisions, you do go through that process of meeting with the employee. And of course, when I say meeting, I'm conscious that they might not be able to come into the workplace, so it might be a Zoom meeting or something off-site, but giving them the opportunity to respond to the employer's concern and to present any alternatives. That's for somebody whose role is covered by a mandatory vaccination order. If you've got a role where an order doesn't apply, but the employer has conducted a risk assessment, and in terms of that risk assessment, the employer determines that actually the risks around this role can only be managed by vaccination. And as part of that, the employer would need to start with risks and then look at how those risks are managed through PPE, hygiene, distancing, the usual measures, and then consider the residual risk after those measures are implemented, and then considered, okay, if vaccination is used as a control measure under the Health and Safety Act, what's the residual risk after vaccination? If at the end of all of that, they still determine that there's an unacceptably high risk, that risk assessment should then be shared with staff. It should be part of a policy that the employer is proposing to adopt. That employer should then consult with staff generally about the proposed policy and invite comments on the policy and the risk assessment before that then gets implemented. Once you've gone through that, that is then back into the other process I was talking about before of saying to staff, right, we've done our risk assessment, we've implemented our policy, we've consulted about that, we've had conversations with you to support your decision making around vaccination, and now we're looking at whether you can actually formally fill out your role, or whether your decision or vaccination status means you can no longer do that. So those are the two. It gets to the same point eventually, but it's a slightly longer process if it's an employer not covered by a vaccination order, because it needs to carefully go through its own risk assessment process and develop a policy and have that conversation with staff around that first.
Thank you, Shima. That was a very comprehensive response.
Sorry, I've probably used up the first half hour, have I?
No, this is really, really useful. And we've had one question come up, I'm wondering if you can respond to, from Tessa. How can they, the employer, realistically measure the risk? What information are they going off to do that from a scientific perspective?
Great question. Don't have the answer. And genuinely not being flippant about that, when WorkSafe released its guidelines a couple of months ago now, there were, I think, 6 or 7 factors that an employer, you went through, and do we tick these boxes? I have to say that assessment is very minimal, and there is not guidance about high, medium, low risk, and everybody has a different perception of risk. What I consider to be an acceptable risk, I mean, you're talking to somebody who's bungee jumped and jumped out of aeroplanes. Other people might say, no way in hell am I doing that. That's totally an unacceptable risk. So the short answer, Tessa, is there is not a lot of guidance out there. Every employer will weigh risk differently, depending on their workplace, depending on their staff, depending on their own, background and life experiences. And really, we're just doing what feels right, and that's really imprecise, both in health and safety and employment terms. But employers are doing what feels right, and I think genuinely considering some other things that sit outside the WorkSafe assessment, because the WorkSafe assessment deals just with health and safety, but there's other aspects there too, and there's quite some debate amongst employment lawyers around, for example, if you've got employees who have health issues and have genuine concern and fear about working with an unvaccinated colleague, how do you manage that? Now, that's not in WorkSafe's risk assessment, and some lawyers I've seen have come out and said, no, that's not valid, you can't rely on that. But if you're an employer faced with a person saying, I really don't feel comfortable coming into work and working alongside unvaccinated colleagues, I feel you're not providing me with a safe place to work, this is causing me distress and anxiety, then the employer has to manage that and somehow has to weigh that. The other thing that's missing from the risk assessment is business continuity risk. That's just not there at all. And actually for employers, that's massive. I mean, the reality being that you could be shut down for up to 14 days, that your staff have to all self-isolate at home, that all of their families have to self-isolate, that you're contact tracing with clients that have been in, you know, and for, I imagine, for a lot of the services you're providing, the loss of trust, the fear in your communities of coming back to that service, knowing it has been through that experience, that could have a hugely detrimental effect. And that's just not contemplated at all. And my personal opinion is I think it absolutely has to be. I mean, taking it into a completely different sector, you imagine a kiwi fruit pack house getting shut down, you know, in main pack season, and tons of fruit being dumped, and China potentially saying we're not taking any fruit from New Zealand. But that is not a factor that certainly that WorkSafe says to take into account, or even the government with its pared back list of 4 factors has taken into account. But my personal view is I think it absolutely has to be, because otherwise everyone's going to be out of a job if your organisation stops running. Seeing the chats come up, does that leave employers open for PGs if the risk assessment is so subjective? Yes. The reality is anytime you do something to an employee, you potentially have a personal grievance. However, I think the key here is being able to explain and show why you did it. Are you doing this, first of all, in good faith, in an unbiased and open-minded way? Are you explaining to employees why you have reached that risk assessment? So it's not being capricious or thoughtless. You say, well, look, we appreciate you might have a different perception of risk to us, but this is where we've landed and this is why. So yes, there will always be a risk of a personal grievance if you're terminating somebody's employment. So I think the important thing, again, is that conversation with staff around this is why we got to the position we've reached. And yeah, I take the point. Business continuity is a two-way street. If you're losing staff, I absolutely get that. That's where we are. I mean, that's probably not a legal comment. It's a reality check.
Thank you. That was really informative. Yeah, it's really concerning about that risk assessment being so subjective, and how employees address that. And yeah. And
I think also, for example, you know, again, that WorkSafe one, it talks about factors, but you know, as I was saying, I would look at it as a 2-stage process. What are the risks? Can we manage them with hygiene, PPE and distancing? Because actually, if that brings things down to an acceptably low risk, you don't even get into a conversation about vaccination. It's only if you still consider the risk to be high that you get into, well, then we have vaccination as an additional measure, risk management measure, and then we look at the residual risk after that. And I had hoped that the WorkSafe guidance would be a little clearer around that sort of a process, but that's certainly the way I would approach it.
That puts a lot more onus on employers around the risk assessment, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it means you can't jump straight to vaccination. And I think that has to be right in the sense that we've all been living with COVID for 18 months now. We've all put measures in place one way or another to try and deal with the risk. And so it's not now, oh, okay, we've got vaccines, so that's the answer, because actually we can't forget what's gone before. And, you know, I have had people say to me, well, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to effectively not quite put someone in a hazmat suit, but they're going to have to wear a higher level of PPE if they want to be in the workplace as an unvaccinated person. They are going to be physically distanced from their colleagues. They're not going to be able to, for example, sit in the tea room. They're going to have their own space again away. And so, I mean, there's a huge degree of social isolation there. But in health and safety terms, you're isolating a potential hazard as well. So none of these are great outcomes, but they're ways of managing it. And I'm not advocating for one method or another, but yeah, those are the sorts of conversations I'm having with people.
Thank you, Shima. Just had someone say, can you please repeat those 2 steps again? I'm not.
So is that in terms of the risk assessment? Was it Irene?
Yeah. Irene, did you want to clarify?
Yes, please. Yes, the two steps of risk assessment.
Sure. So the first thing I would do is assess the risk. So you start by assessing the risk with no control measures in place. And you go, well, what's the risk? And we would all probably say quite high. And then you would say, right, let's implement the first tranche of control measures, so hygiene, distancing, PPE, those sorts of things. Then you reassess the risk after that and say, okay, how does the risk come out now? Are we looking high, medium, low? Then if we put the next step of control measures, which is vaccination, how does the risk come out at the end of that? So those are the 2 steps, the measures of hygiene, distancing, PPE, then reassess, then vaccination, then reassess.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Shima. I'm just going on to another few questions, and these are from Marama, and you may want to add to them, Marama, but clarity on leave requirements when staff require isolation, or they're waiting on test results. Yeah, what I assume, what leave are they able to take?
Yeah, so not massive clarity on that. The governmentemployment.govt website gives options. If someone's sick and they're waiting for a test, they're on sick leave. That's easy because they fall within the parameters of the Holidays Act. They're sick or ill or unable to work. So it's sick leave, and that's why sick leave was increased to 10 days a year earlier this year. Where you have someone who's not sick, but who, for example, was at a location of interest, or who might have a family member, or who has, for whatever reason, had to have a test and is waiting for test results and has been told to stay home, that's where it's not clear. What I would advise is taking a cautious approach and paying them because they're not sick. I mean, sorry, and I'm assuming these are people who are not able to work remotely. So if they can work remotely or do some work remotely, they're just being paid because they're continuing to work. These are people who, for whatever reason, can't perform their role remotely. The indications are that the employer should continue to pay them some form of special paid leave. But what is available for employers and has been available since February this year is a thing called the COVID-19 short-term absence payment. And that's available for people who can't work from home and have to miss work to stay home while they're waiting for a COVID test result. That is a one-off payment of $359 for each worker, and the employer can only apply for it once a month for any eligible employee unless that person's been told to get another test. So the not very short answer to that is if somebody has to stay home while they wait for a test, you should keep paying them unless they're sick, in which case they're on sick leave. But there is some financial assistance available for employers that do have to pay. In that circumstance, they can apply for that short-term payment.
Excellent. Another question from Marama. Staff rights when clients do not want to answer screening questions.
Yeah, and this is this intersection where we have health and safety law and privacy law and Human Rights Act, and none of them work together. So the short answer in terms of the Privacy Act is if you are asking a client about their vaccination status, at the time you ask them about their vaccination status, you need to tell them that they don't have to answer the question, but that if they choose not to answer, you will treat them as being unvaccinated. And that is so that they have the information up front when considering whether and how to answer that question. They understand what essentially the potential consequences might be in terms of how you will react to their response. So, so if a client doesn't want to answer a screening question, that's cool. They don't have to, but they do need to be told that you will be assumed that they're unvaccinated, and presumably that will affect the way, or that might affect the way in which you deliver services to that individual. So yes, staff are allowed to ask, because now, and I've seen that Marama has said, my understanding is no if delivering a health and social service, and I understand the point being that you have to deliver that service. However, and again, this is the disconnect, that staff member, for example, has a right to refuse unsafe work under the Health and Safety Act. They might want to put in place additional safety measures, PPE, hygiene, distancing, whatever. And so my advice would be that you can ask the question, because I think your staff members need to be able to do that for their own personal safety. But you still have to deliver service. What you can't do is if a person says no, or I'm not answering that, you can't then say, well, we're out, that's it, we're not providing services at that point. And I would welcome any comments or challenge on that, because I think this is a really tricky area, because you've got to keep your staff safe, and they need information to do that. Or the alternative is you just assume everybody's unvaccinated and treat everybody as if they were unvaccinated, and avoid asking the question altogether, and put in place whatever additional measures you need to on the basis of that assumption.
Is there any feedback or about that? Because this is quite a critical point, and it sort of goes to our next topic in some ways about delivering services to people who are unvaccinated or do not disclose.
We've put those steps in place, and I know a lot of the community centres haven't, but we say to all people, we ask them, and if they say no, we say that's absolutely fine, we'll just do things a little differently. And so we work remotely, or we work outside, just fine while the sun's shining. So yeah, I'm thinking about that in the new year, because we work all over Tauranga in various community centres where they're not asking the question. And so I'm going back to because I'm saying to my staff, it's your choice. If you work with people who are, you know, who you work in these places, sorry, I've said that from a work perspective, we will not work face-to-face with people who aren't vaccinated, but going forward next year, we're going to have to figure out, can we work in places where they don't have those policies in place, and how will we keep the staff safe? And that might be separate entrance, it will be appointments rather than drop-ins, it'll be screening, and it might be outdoors, and it will be bigger rooms with more ventilation and things like that as well, to try and mitigate the risk, but not deny anyone service.
No, thank you.
No, that was some awesome feedback. For us, it's not so much whether or not they've had the vaccines, it's more having the knowledge if they've had symptoms. So if they refuse to answer questions around the symptoms for our staff, it's about how to keep them safe in terms of, if we've got whānau out there that just refuse to answer any of those types of screening questions. So for us, we're just informing our staff, if they're refusing to answer screening questions, then they've got a right to pull back and say, well, in terms of keeping our staff safe, they may not get a face-to-face. It may be some other type of support that they receive, whether it's virtual or by phone. So yeah, that's what we've put in place for our staff, and just having appointments when they're coming into our office, so that even our administration staff know who's coming in the doors, because we've got a walk-in policy as well, similar to the community centres. So yeah, it's just putting those extra measures in place for our staff to keep them safe as well. But thank you, Shima.
That's all good. And of course, the other thing is, I hate to say it, but people lie. People will tell you they don't have symptoms because they don't want a COVID test. So, in some ways, the safest policy is to assume everybody's unvaccinated and treat them as if they do have symptoms, and that's the only way you can be super safe for your staff. I mean, that puts up lots of barriers, in all sorts of different ways. But that's the tension in all of this, isn't it? Is delivering those services and keeping your staff safe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Shima. That was very helpful. I'm just going to move on to another question from Maggie from Te Manu Taurua. Staff wanting to be paid their termination notice period, knowing they were not going to be vaccinated, and leaving their resignation to the last day. Having checked with legal team, as they are not legally able to present for employment, we are not legally bound to pay their notice period. However, staff are expecting this as a right.
Yeah, I saw that one and I thought, interesting. And I have to say, I am seeing, I shouldn't call it fun and games, but there is a little bit of game playing around some of the timing of this stuff. There's a lot of people with big sick leave balances who are currently on sick leave and essentially running the clock down till the 1st of January, using up their sick leave, knowing they're going to be terminated, but essentially making the period for which they'll be paid as long as possible, which on the one hand I understand. So, but this is a slightly different thing, people leaving their resignation to the last day. Now, that's a really interesting question, because when an employee resigns, they still owe their employer their service for the period, for the notice period. And so someone who gets a bit cute and says, well, I'll resign on the very last day, but you've got a contractual obligation to pay me 4 weeks' notice. I don't know who Maggie's lawyers are, but I agree, because the employee is not actually able to work for the notice period, whatever that might be, and particularly if they're not able to work because of the effect of a mandatory vaccination order, the employer is not obliged to pay. And the employer would say either, thank you for your resignation, but as you are not able to work for your notice period, you will simply be unpaid for that period. Or you could potentially try and agree with the employee that their employment ends sooner. What you wouldn't want to do is get into a situation where the employer says, oh, well, that's fine, you can finish up today, because that would trigger an obligation for the employer to pay the employee in lieu of notice, if they've got the ability to do that in the employment agreement. So, yeah, really interesting. But where an employee, for whatever reason, is not able to work, if, for example, that's a mandatory order and they're not vaccinated, then my view is that the employer is not obliged to pay out that notice period. It's simply unpaid.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions anyone would like to add to that? Okay, Tessa's put in the chat, and also Tessa's sent through a number of sort of comments and feedback around these issues. And I might be summarising this incorrectly, and if I am, please correct me, Tessa. But the key focus seems to be real concern about safety of clients. If staff are leaving and say it's social worker working with someone who's traumatized, and obviously the relationship with the social worker and the client is really critical, then potentially puts that client at risk if they're no longer able to work with that worker. Is that correct, Tessa?
Yeah, I think it's really acknowledging that the social sector is a little bit different from some other sectors in where social connection is a key element of the therapeutic journey. And the fact that we've got some very highly experienced specialists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, people specialising in sexual abuse, social work, counselling, who are going to be leaving or have left already, and many clients are basically at high risk of suicide. So it's like, where is this gap where I like Whairanga and Shirley, these mitigating things of what you can do, but if you turn up to someone who's been raped with a hand over their face in a mask and PPE, that's not going to be conducive to being able to do a healing intervention with them. So, for me, vaccination is down one end of the scale. There are lots of other factors in between that we're not allowed to talk about, like the rapid antigen testing, or what does health actually look like. Because remembering, if you're vaccinated, you can still spread COVID and get COVID. So it's not this blanket answer. So where are the conversations which actually are focused on client safety if they choose that they don't care whether their practitioner is vaccinated or not?
Shima, I don't know, have you have any comments on this? In some ways, I think it's also a discussion, and I would be welcome people to share their thoughts on this and their own experiences if they've lost experienced social workers, and how that's impacting on their delivery to clients.
Yeah, so lots to unpack there, but and you're right, Tessa, I accept there is a huge gap in terms of what we're being asked to do legally and the reality on the ground. And I agree, it is a gap. Just your last comment about what if the client doesn't mind about the vaccination status of the social worker or clinician or whomever that they're interacting with. In terms of the situation we're currently in, that's actually irrelevant. If the clinicians or the service provider is captured by the order, client choice isn't a factor that gets considered. And I hear what you're saying, but yeah, I'm not defending it, but you're right, it is a gap, and I think this is a bigger conversation for me to step back now out of and let you have amongst yourselves.
Yeah, because it is a gap, and if we don't say anything about it, the whole thing with social work is around social justice and equity, non-discrimination, tino rangatiratanga, and all of that seems to have gone out of the window with the orders, and that doesn't feel right for a lot of people. So where can there be a conversation back to government to say, actually, this may cause more harm than the people that it's perceived to be saving? I think there's no risk analysis from that point of view, and that's a big failure.
Anyone have any comments or observations with regards to that?
Yeah, hold on. I appreciate the advice and the conversation that has been had here. But I think when it comes to close reality of this hitting home, which we've had those cases here in Mangatapu and Haidini with the unvaccinated, in our Māori social sector, the impact of this is huge. Understanding that people have made their choices to be unvaccinated, it's when that they engage with the community and that it starts to spread amongst our community. What that spread does, and I've seen the impact that it's happened within our families just only in 1 week. It's the anger that these families have, but it's also the pain that these small babies, and I'm talking about babies under 5, babies that are like 2 years old. And then we've got also our unit, which is the Puwhariki unit, where they're newbies starting 5 and 6. Understand that we're talking about working in the social sector, which actually comes on a broad view for Māori. So I'm really interested in how we're actually addressing this. Because when it comes to the reality of it, when it hits close to home, yeah, it's not something good. And the disruption that it has for families, but also the work, the time that is taken to reorganize the whole of the family. And we must remember that Māori don't just live in homes on their own and their children. We've got intergenerational in these homes. So we've got from kaumātua right down to babies. Now, whether we're talking about rangatiratanga, that doesn't exist when we're sitting in COVID. So I'm just really interested with some of the comments, how we're addressing it. And it's not until actually COVID actually hits the whānau, and I've seen it and been that in the last week. Understanding that we're also working with families that are traumatized as well. We've got to be creative in how we're going to do that. And I hear some of you talking about this may have to be by virtual in the way we do that, because making the contact and infecting the rest of the whānau is not the answer either.
Thank you, Irene. I think we've got 2 different perspectives, and that's all good because that's what we're dealing with. That's the reality that we're all trying to tackle at the moment and address, and it's that tension which is just horrible for everyone, really. One of the things I was just thinking and hearing both of you talk is I wonder whether a piece of work that maybe Social Link, or I even think nationally, is about what is the impact, looking from both perspectives, on clients, on staff, on service delivery for social service providers, to understand what has the impact been for community organisations, which we can then communicate to the powers that be. And I just wonder whether anyone who's got any thoughts about that, whether you think that would be useful. But I'm just thinking, to hear from the client perspective of what it's meant for them, and from staff perspective and employer manager perspectives, what you've had to deal with, like losing staff, what's been involved in that, and how you deliver services. What has the impact been? I don't know, any thoughts on that?
think sadly there's huge anger in people who have, I mean, I'm a nurse, so I'm pretty pro-vaccine, but people feel quite vilified, and I just see it on social media with friends who have taken that choice, that the speed at which conversations deteriorate and become personal and abusive. And I think it's on us to make even more effort than we usually do to make people feel accepted for whatever the decision is that they've made. And I like what Shima was saying, and certainly when I've done any sort of risk assessments in the past, you do your before and after controls are added, analysis, and look at the mitigations and whether that gives you, and then test your appetite for risk, I guess. And I think even more we have to be really mindful of the way that we engage with people, because I do agree with the things that Tess is saying, but I also agree with Irene. If we don't protect our services and we don't protect our staff, we won't be there for our clients down track. That's the risk, that we lose a lot of passionate, committed and skilled people. So I think rather than looking at it as two sides of the argument, rather than coming to the middle and saying, well, okay, how do we actually work through this? How do we make sure that we include everybody and make everyone feel welcome, and find a way to work with people that doesn't isolate and marginalise people who are already marginalised.
Thank you, Shirley.
And I think that it's too soon to do that work, because any change is disruptive right at the beginning, and this is sort of at the beginning, but I think it needs a little more time to bed in, if you like. Not a long time, but because people need to be remember how they felt, but also see how it pans out a bit. I'm not talking leave it months and months and months. I'm talking about leave it a little bit longer. Although Christmas is will exacerbate things too. I know from my own family experience. But,
yeah. We've gone through the questions we've had so far, I think, most of them. If I haven't covered what's been sent through, please, are there any other questions people have? So we've sort of talked a lot about the how do you deal with staff who choose not to be vaccinated, and then I'll be interested to hear from you about what impact that's had in terms of delivering services to clients. We also talked about how to deliver services to people who aren't vaccinated, and I think we've sort of covered most of that. But yeah, any other questions or comments or observations, or what's been happening for you in your organisation, how you're dealing with all these factors, all these things?
I just had a question, but I'm really sorry. I was late because I was in another meeting, so shut me down if you've already had it. It was around the rapid antigen testing. And what I put in our policy was to say that it's something that we will consider, and as more information becomes available, because of obviously the accuracy of it, the cost of it, because we're not mandated. So yeah, I guess, and as I say, I've been trying to make decisions about the new year, and I've decided just to take a deep breath and wait, because, by the time we sort of come back around 10th of January, things could be vastly different than they are now. And so I decided I was getting myself in knots for no reason, that we would continue to work remotely and I would reassess it in the new year. But one of those things to be considered is the use of the rapid antigen testing for people who are asymptomatic and who wish to engage face-to-face in service, or staff members who are non-vaccinated, asymptomatic, and wish to engage with clients.
Any comments? Or Shima, do you have anything to
I'm no expert on rapid antigen testing, but I mean, I agree with you, Shirley, because the last 18 months, I felt like no sooner do I give some advice than within 24, 48 hours, 7 days, I feel like, should I be ringing all those clients back and saying, oh, you know, that conversation we had? Well, actually, the world has completely changed and I need to update you on today's news. And as an aside, I also love how, especially last year, you know, we'd get the 1 o'clock briefing and then my phone would start to ring and I'm thinking, gosh, I've had the same 5 minutes to process as everybody else has. There's no pre-briefing for employment lawyers here. So look, we're all doing the best we can. But one thing I would absolutely say is those policies, those risk assessments, they need to be kept under review. You know, I'm with you, Shirley, a month is a long time in COVID times. And as new things become available, we do need to be revisiting those. That might not be the sort of full-blown consultation with staff, but it's letting staff know, okay, rapid antigen testing, for example, is online. This is a great new tool. It allows us to do things in certain ways. What we're proposing is this. You know, has anyone got any comments before we kind of embed that process moving forward? But yeah, I think that's the thing. It's not a set and forget. It's very much you know, our knowledge and the tools we've got are changing all the time, and we need to use what we can, the best tools we can. I think I just called myself a tool.
I actually said that to I've got a staff member who's not vaccinated, and I've said that to a tool. I said to her, you know what, we'll work it out together as we go forward, because I don't know what next year is going to look like, and I don't know what we're going to face, but we will face it together and we will talk and we will find some options, because this is not about trying to get rid of anyone. This is about keeping us all safe. So, you know, we're all in it together. It's not an us and them, a me and them, sorry. Yeah, who knows? We might all be working remotely permanently if things get out of hand, or we might, you know, we'll get Omicron and develop antigens and not have to worry. Who knows?
Thanks, Shirley. Anyone else, Priscilla, or PB Tech, or Marama? No? I'm just wondering as well, would it be useful, Shirley, you say you've got a policy. Have you, and Marama, do you have a policy? Have you developed a policy for Whairanga?
Oh, we've got a few policies. Liz, we've got a COVID-19 facilitator because we have health contracts as well, not just social service contracts. So we're a health and social service, and we've just received some more support from Ministry to mobilise our services. So it's a work in progress. It's always changing and evolving. So yeah, we have policies. We have a committee within our house with a representative from each team that meet weekly, at least weekly. So it's always changing, always evolving. Yeah, and it's just trying to keep informed with the latest news. Like Shima said, you know, those daily updates. Create a policy, give out the advice, and then the next day it'll be different. Yeah. So yeah, it's just keeping on our toes, really. Luckily, we've got someone that's dedicated to that space, so that she keeps us up to date with what's going on.
That's great. That's a great resource for you.
Yeah, definitely.
I was wondering whether it would be useful for if organisations were happy to do it, to share their policies, but I'm guessing that, I mean, and tell me if that is the case, but given, like you say, they're changing so quickly, the minute you give them to us, they'll probably be out of date. So probably isn't that helpful? I know what people think.
The other space we want to look at is for our marae. So like one of our marae in Matapihi, they've just created a policy around whānau that have had their vaccines, that haven't, and opening up again for tangihanga. So that's always changing and evolving, and each marae have their own whakaaro. A lot of them are still closed because it is a difficult space for our whānau to turn away whānau that are not vaxxed, but as Auntie Irene said, we've had some cases in our hapu, which is a real eye-opener when it's on your doorstep. And it's about keeping our own generation safe, especially our babies, because they can't get the vaccines. So at the end of the day, we may be staff members, we may be managers, but first and foremost, we are mothers and we're grandmothers. So we're trying to keep those generations safe. And actually our kaumatua are really good. We had our kaumatua in our house last Thursday. They come to a day program, but they all turned up with their vaccine passes, and they didn't even need, they're just used to presenting vaccine passes when they're going into new spaces. And they were awesome. They came in, here's my vaccine pass, even though we didn't need to see them. So they're really good at, they've taken the vaccines on board. It's around how do we transfer that to the rest of our whānau to encourage them to do the same thing. Because if our kaumatua can get these vaccines, if it's good enough for our kaumatua, really it's good enough for all our whānau. So that's sort of the spaces that we're working in. So it was really good to see that from our kaumatua, and just trying to protect our babies and our mokopuna.
Of course. Yeah, and it's great role modelling by kaumatua, isn't it, for the rest of the whānau?
Yeah, and a lot of our iwi now are sharing the stories of our kaumatua as well, so that's really good to see.
Yeah.
Trying to motivate whānau through, our older generations.
That's awesome. Any other comments, questions? I found this extremely useful, Shima. I've been rapidly writing notes. We're recording this, of course, and we'll take some brief notes as well. But yeah, I've clarified a lot of things for me. So is there anything else, Priscilla?
I was just going to say, I'm happy to share anything anybody wants. Don't know it all, obviously, but very happy to share. At least sometimes it's a place to start. I think people are a bit overwhelmed with where to even begin sometimes.
Yep.
So if you're happy to share, I can post that on our COVID page. But I hate to do this, so I put the responsibility on you to let me know when it's been updated.
Oh yeah, no, that's cool. And Shima might want to look at it first. I did pass it through the EMA, but
okay.
The only thing about putting it out there for other people to use is
it'll be good.
And a policy is just that, it's a policy and it's got to be right for your organisation. So I would see it as a place to start and use it and make it work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It won't work for everybody.
Absolutely. Priscilla, do you have any questions or comments?
I just wanted to say that I've absolutely enjoyed the korero that's gone on this morning. We come into Anglican Care Waiapu, and so we have lots of policies and bits and pieces, and they're usually guided by what the government say. We've certainly lost a lot of staff along the way, and respect their choice to be unvaccinated. But of course, for us here at Papua Family Services, it's very, very clear what Anglican Care expect of us. I'd love to share it and what we have, but it's not my decision to make, unfortunately. But we pretty much, every time the government makes changes, we always get an update, and it's usually guided by what the government have issued to everybody, really. But I just wanted to say it's been really good listening to all the korero that's gone on, and to Shima, to hear the advice that you've given, because I've certainly had some questions and you've answered those, and also hearing what other services and what other people are doing as well. And Tessa too, good on you, Tessa, for being that strong advocate and for saying what you've said, because I sat here thinking, gosh, I hadn't even thought about that. When COVID's in the house, I must admit, sometimes there are things that go out the window because it's real, it's here. It certainly is affecting people. Our whānau, I mean, it's made its way all the way over to Matakana Island, which is where I'm from. And so I certainly understand what Irene is saying when she talks about, COVID is here, and there are some things that, whānau need to step up to the plate and play their part. It includes being vaccinated and stuff like that. But I recognise too that there are whānau out there who don't believe in that. And I respect that. But at the end of the day, COVID doesn't discriminate. Just the other day I was reading, we have a Facebook page for the island, And it was heartbreaking to see whānau talk about being isolated and not being able to communicate with people face to face as opposed to being on social media. So coming here today, it's been absolutely fantastic. And thank you all for sharing your thoughts and your feelings and your opinions. I've certainly taken that on board here, and we're going through change as well with staff too. So, oh my goodness, gosh, it's good to know that we're not the only ones sitting in the boat. There's other people in the boat with us. So aroha to you, to everybody out there, and let's keep supporting each other because we need to. We absolutely need to. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, kia ora, Priscilla.
Yeah.
That was, lovely kororo. It's a great way to finish up, but I see there's another question. I think it might have been yours, Tessa.
It was from someone. It was from another person. So, but also just thank you. Lovely to see you, Priscilla. But we also do need to remember it's not just the unvaccinated that spread COVID. It's also the vaccinated. So, that really fuels the division. So really be careful about the languaging about that. But yeah, the question was going back to the beginning of, if you have to work out, you're not able to work out 4 weeks leave, what is the case if you're fired? So you're unable to work out the 4 weeks leave from that point of view.
So if the employer brings the employment to an end, so if the employer terminates, then the employee gets 4 weeks notice or their contractual notice period, whichever is longer, and that's on pay, irrespective of whether they can work it or not, because it's the employer ending the employment relationship, and the employer has to comply in the same way as if the employee resigns, they're expected to work out their notice period. If the employer terminates and gives notice, then that's expected to be notice on pay, even if the employee can't work.
Thanks.
Thanks for that.
Sorry, Liz, I think this is really interesting, and I'm mindful we have the legal perspective coming in, and when you're talking, Shima, I'm thinking about what this actually is for not only the Māori sector, but for whānau hapu iwi within the tauranga moana te tai hauuru, the Western Bay, is that there are huge implications. And I'm appreciative that we're getting the legal dialogue, but Marama and Priscilla probably touch it, just scrapes along the top, is that Māoridom, and thank you ladies, e wahine mā. Honestly, the conversations that I've had with iwi Māori in regards to our marae are something of grave concerns, very grave concerns, because all whānau are feeling discriminated, separatism. They can't access their marae because that's been called by a government call, what that stipulation is for marae. And understanding that, we've always had that kōrero. This is Māori's last point or bastion point for them to stand. And it's becoming a place where it isn't, that we become discriminative. So I'm listening and it's good, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, the conversations about legal terms, it's probably, rubbing quite strongly with us as well, is those are some of the things we need to think about Māori, and also those are working in the Māori sector, but those that are working with whānau hapu and iwi. I don't know, but it's good to sit here and just thank you for everyone's contribution in those concerns. And it's good to also hear it's changing every day or every week. It tends to change, and I've seen that as well. And I think that will also change for us, and we still need to sit at the table, like how we're here as Māori leaders and Māori whānau hapu and iwi, what that actually looks like. Even the discussion is maybe we close our marae until such time we're at a stage to reopen. Yeah, we don't know.
Mm.
So yeah, we're sitting out there a little bit with the big question mark around us as well.
Kia ora,
So thank
Irene.
you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Maybe a final question more from me that I'm interested to hear from providers is one thing that's been on the back of my mind is, you know, if there is a rapid increase of COVID cases in Tauranga Moana, and social services traditionally close for the very, very well-deserved break they need over the Christmas sort of early to mid-Jan period, is there any sort of contingency planning happening by yourselves, or you know of others, or I'm just wondering how that's been addressed? Do any of you know, got any comments on that, or?
I wondered about that today, actually. I got the email asking, you know, I can't remember what they've called it, the response and what we need to do. We only close between Christmas and New Year, and we have skeleton staff on, and normally it's quite quiet around that time, but I'm fully prepared for it not to be, for it to be a lot busier than previous because of people having to isolate. And I'm also, the other thing I wonder about, and I asked Ministry of Health this, if we have people who come in who then test positive, we have to close the doors and do a deep clean. And I'm thinking, if we have a lot of cases, the door's going to be going like this. So that's, you know, who knows, it's all crystal ball gazing, but yeah, that's going to have a big impact as well on lots of services.
Yeah.
Talk of that. I just wanted to clarify, Liz, in regards to the island. A lot of our whānau are related to the whānau over at Maungatapu, and of course, Irene and yeah, so they're related, and that's how it went over there. People are isolating over there. So I just wanted to clarify that. And also just to clarify that when I spoke about the unvaccinated, it was purely in relation to them. And not necessarily the vaccinated, which, just to clarify what Tess was saying before, we are closed for about 3 weeks over the Christmas New Year period. We close on the 23rd next week, and we reopen again on the 17th, and there is no plan to reopen in that time that we're away until we come back. But I just want to acknowledge Shirley's comments. Goodness me, hopefully it doesn't get to that stage, but it's certainly looking that way, because I think on Wednesday Auckland opens up, and this is no disrespect to Auckland, but they open up, and so whatever's there or anywhere else in the country is going to be moving around the country for the Christmas New Year period. So I guess people probably need to be planning just in case. And touch wood, Omicron hasn't made it here, at least not to my knowledge. I haven't checked the news, but fingers and toes crossed, and arms and legs and everything, it doesn't make it here. But that's pretty much what's happening for Papamoa Family Services. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you, Priscilla.
Hi,
Alison.
hi, Alison. Now, thank you very much for having me. I'm in Christchurch, so really nice to be part of the group. So grew up in Tauranga, so really interested in hearing what's going on there. I mean, I think the other group that we haven't talked about today, and I don't want to divert the conversation off, is that many of our organisations are dependent on volunteers. And so the relationship that you maintain with your volunteers through all of this is hugely important as well. And so, you know, we've talked this morning about the importance of having those constructive conversations with paid staff. Having those with your volunteer team is just as important, because for many of us, and so many organisations, actually we can't deliver the services that we do without the support of those volunteers. So they're absolutely crucial to the work that we're doing. And we need to maintain that volunteer base, and they become our links out into the community. They talk about our services. They're a great sort of spreader of information about our organisation. So we have really complex relationships with those volunteers as well. And so just maintaining those relationships and taking due cognizance of the importance of those throughout this process is so important. And I totally agree with people in terms of the there's just going to be this constant change, and we're going to be on top of having to be on top of the ball all the way through just to manage that as it constantly changes in front of us. So just a plug for the volunteers, really.
Oh, thank you, Alison. That's really important. You're absolutely right that volunteers need to be treated pretty much the same as staff in terms of working in good faith and so on. So thank you for that. Marama, were you going to say something about how Whairanga is dealing with things over the Christmas period?
Yeah, hi. So we're closing the same time as Bristle Adam. So we close on the 23rd and reopen on the 17th. Our staff come into a wānanga, but we have skeleton staff over that time working as well, because we've got some services like home-based support for our kaumātua that just continue throughout that closure. We've got a meeting tomorrow with our COVID-19 facilitator in terms of welfare packages for whānau over that closure time if they need support. So yeah, I'll know more tomorrow when we meet. What the plan is. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. It's obviously you're all putting things in place, and as you say, it's just such a changeable environment. It's hard to plan ahead. So thank you. I don't think there's any more questions in chat, unless anyone's got any more questions, I think, or observations. We can close off.
The only thing I was going to say, and I appreciate I'm the lawyer, is the law is a very blunt instrument, and reflecting on Irene's comments and comments from others as well, it's about the kōrero, the conversation, those relationships. Because you know what, by the time you're getting down the legal path, you've kind of lost it. If you can handle things, and this is why I say always start less formal, give yourself room to escalate. If you can handle it through your conversations and your relationships, I genuinely think that's a much better way than having to go legal on something. And that's coming from the lawyer.
Thank you, Shima. That's a really, really good point, and maybe a good one to finish on. Look, I'd really like to thank you all for participating, and Shima for your insight and advice has been extremely helpful. And if I don't see some of you before Christmas, I hope you have a very merry kirihimete and a great break. And I really hope you will be getting a break over this time, because you sure need it. It's been a hard year. So I'll just finish off with karakia, unless anyone would like to put up their hand for karakia. No. Okay.
You started, you finish it.
Okay. Here we go. Kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei wā, mana kitea mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ai ki te aurangi. Kia ora. Stay safe. Take care, everyone. Have a great break.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Shima.